Medieval cities existed in a relationship with fire that was both essential and dangerous, for flame lay at the center of everyday life. Without sufficient natural light, people relied on torches, candles, and oil lamps to extend their waking hours beyond sunset. Fire was used for cooking, heating, metalworking, baking bread, and processing hides, making it present in nearly every household. As a result, medieval cities were never truly without fire, not even in the depths of night or during long, damp seasons of rain. Smoldering hearths inside wooden homes created warmth and comfort, yet they also planted the seeds of constant danger. People grew accustomed to living beside fire, to the point that the smell of smoke and the glow of embers became an unquestioned part of daily life. Within the cramped spaces of the city, fire existed not only in homes, but spilled out into the streets through workshops and communal facilities. Bakeries, forges, dyeworks, and shared kitchens all relied on large, open flames placed close to densely packed dwellings. All it took was one night of strong winds or a single careless moment for fire to slip beyond control. Medieval cities were enclosed by stone walls, trapping heat and swirling winds within narrow confines. When a fire broke out, it had nowhere to escape, forcing it to spread sideways across wooden roofs, balconies, and overhanging structures. Many people slept near their hearths to keep warm, making early detection of fire far more difficult. Countless major fires began as tiny, unnoticed flames flaring up while the city lay deep in sleep. At first, only a roof smoldered, but soon entire streets were swallowed whole. The familiar nighttime sounds of the city abruptly transformed into cracking timber, frantic screams, and the chaotic tolling of alarm bells. Panicked residents flooded into the streets, clutching their most precious belongings as thick black smoke choked the sky. In such moments, the densely populated city became a vast fire trap. Blazes destroyed not only homes, but granaries, workshops, and the long-term livelihoods of entire communities. After each great fire, the city was left with ash-charred beams and memories that haunted generations. Thus, fire both sustained medieval cities and constantly stood ready to destroy them without warning. The constant presence of fire made the risk of urban conflagration an inseparable part of medieval life. People understood this reality, yet had no choice but to continue living alongside the danger. And to understand why fire spread so easily, often consuming entire cities, we must look closely at the very structure of urban housing. From there, the story turns to building materials and city layouts that transformed medieval towns into vast tinderboxes. The structure of housing in medieval cities was one of the greatest reasons why fires could ignite easily and spread beyond control. Most homes were built with wooden frames, wattle and daub walls, and roofs thatched with straw or thin planks, materials that caught fire extremely quickly. The timber used in construction was often untreated and exposed to years of sun and rain, becoming dry and brittle, and thus highly flammable. Houses were built tightly packed together, sharing walls or separated by gaps, barely wide enough for a single person to pass through. Many buildings had upper stories that jutted out over the streets, causing roofs and balconies to nearly touch one another and allowing flames to leap easily from house to house. When one roof caught fire, glowing embers and burning fragments fell onto neighboring roofs, spreading the blaze in an unstoppable chain. Narrow streets prevented sunlight from reaching the ground, leaving lower levels damp, while rooftops dried and overheated, creating a dangerous imbalance. During dry summer days, a single spark was enough to ignite entire rows of thatched roofs almost simultaneously. Small, tightly sealed windows caused smoke to accumulate rapidly inside homes, making it difficult for occupants to detect fires early. When doors were flung open in panic, the sudden rush of air only fed the flames, causing them to surge violently. Many families stored dry firewood, straw, and lamp oil inside their homes for convenience, unintentionally adding fuel to any outbreak of fire. Workshops were interwoven with residential areas, their large furnaces built against wooden walls, greatly increasing the risk. Certain districts devoted to trades such as blacksmithing, baking, or tanning were known as the most dangerous zones, yet due to a lack of urban planning, these areas remained in the very heart of densely populated cities. Once fire erupted in a single house, there were no open spaces to halt its advance, allowing the blaze to grow exponentially. Residents often tried to save their possessions first, delaying fire suppression during the most critical early moments. In the chaos, tearing down neighboring buildings to create fire breaks was nearly impossible to accomplish in time. Within just a few hours, entire neighborhoods could be reduced to seas of flame and ash. Only after each great fire did people realize that the very way their homes were built had turned the city into a deadly trap. Yet due to limited land and the need to live close to markets and trade, residents continued to rebuild in the same manner. This tightly packed construction made medieval cities resemble bundles of dry kindling, waiting for a single spark to erupt into disaster. But flammable materials alone were not the only reason fires spread so rapidly beyond control. To understand fully, one must also examine the daily habits of city dwellers, where fire was used carelessly as part of everyday life. From these ordinary routines, many great fires quietly took root in the darkness of night. In a medieval urban life, fire was not a rare tool, but an element deeply entwined with even the smallest human activities. Every household kept a hearth directly within its living space, often without a proper chimney to carry smoke and embers outside. Smoke and glowing coals accumulated along wooden ceiling beams, gradually forming layers of soot that could ignite from a single falling spark. Hearth fires were often kept smoldering through the night to avoid the effort of relighting them, unknowingly turning homes into latent hazards. Many fires began when embers rolled onto the floor while the household slept, unnoticed until it was too late. Oil lamps and candles were placed everywhere, for lighting frequently set near fabric curtains, wooden beds, or hanging shelves that ignited easily. Drafts slipping through cracks in doors could tip a lamp, spill oil, and ignite flames in an instant. People grew accustomed to living with this danger and rarely checked their fires carefully before leaving home or going to sleep. Many families cooked in the main living room, where children, animals, and household goods crowded around the hearth. A single small collision could knock over a pot of hot oil or scatter embers into stored straw nearby. Artisans often worked from their homes, using large flames to boil, glue, heat dye vats, or fire tools. These tasks were carried out in confined, poorly ventilated spaces where heat and sparks built up dangerously. At night, many servants and poorer laborers slept beside their workplaces to save space, increasing the risk of death when fires broke out. In taverns and eating houses, hearths burned constantly to serve guests regardless of hour or weather. Mead and lamp oil were stored in wooden barrels. If spilled or broken, they allowed fire to spread uncontrollably. Residents also burned refuse and waste near their homes to avoid foul smells, unintentionally creating open flames beside living quarters. During festival nights, torches and decorative fires filled the streets, greatly increasing the risk of accidents amid dense crowds. Laughter and music masked the initial smell of smoke, causing fires to be discovered only when they had already grown large. These habits repeated themselves across generations, making fire risk so familiar that it was often ignored. Only when entire streets burned did people realize how deeply danger was embedded in their daily routines. This absolute dependence on fire made medieval cities perpetually fragile. Yet even when fires were detected early, the residents' ability to extinguish them was severely limited. From here, the story turns to another crucial cause: the absence of effective firefighting tools and organized response. It was this weakness that transformed small fires into catastrophes capable of reducing entire cities to ashes. When fires broke out in medieval cities, residents had almost no effective firefighting system to confront them. There were no specialized forces, so extinguishing flames depended entirely on the spontaneous reaction of nearby inhabitants. Each household possessed only wooden buckets, small water barrels, or wet blankets, crude tools incapable of battling large fires. Wells were few and often far from the burning area, making water transport painfully slow while flames spread rapidly. In moments of panic, bucket lines frequently broke apart, spilling water and rendering efforts futile. Narrow streets further hindered movement, costing precious early minutes when fires might still have been contained. With no clear plan, people acted on instinct, turning firefighting into a scene of chaos and poor coordination. Some attempted to tear down rooftops to stop the fire's advance, but such actions required time and tools few had ready. When strong winds blew, water became nearly useless as embers were carried far and ignited other rooftops. Church bells were often rung to signal fire, but while the sound warned the city, it did nothing to control the flames. City guards might assist, yet they too lacked proper equipment and often had to prioritize protecting gates, granaries, or churches. In many cases, the only remaining option was to demolish neighboring houses to create fire breaks, a painful and delayed decision. Homeowners frequently resisted the destruction of their property, sparking arguments even as the fire continued to spread. The absence of unified leadership meant each district reacted differently, allowing flames to escape the original area. Many cities had fire prevention rules, but enforcement was weak due to a lack of supervision and meaningful penalties. Even when rain fell, it was often insufficient to extinguish fires that had already taken hold in dry timber and flammable materials. In darkness, orientation became difficult, causing firefighters to collide, stumble, or suffer injuries amid the confusion. Once the fire surpassed human control, people could only flee, abandoning their homes to fate. Thus, fire ceased to be a minor accident and rapidly became a disaster, engulfing entire cities. Afterward, ash and ruin stood as testimony to humanity's helplessness before fire in the medieval world. The lack of organization and tools turned every blaze into a brutal test of urban survival. What could not be extinguished early would spread, leaving consequences that endured for decades. Yet, beyond human limits and crude equipment, nature itself played a powerful role in feeding the flames. Wind, weather, and dry seasons repeatedly and transformed small sparks into unstoppable firestorms. Nature played a decisive role in making medieval fires so devastating, for wind and weather often lay far beyond human control. Many cities were built on hills or open terrain where winds blew strongly and persistently, especially during long, hot, dry seasons. Wind rushing through narrow streets formed swirling currents that fanned flames and carried embers dozens of paces away. Within mere moments, rooftops at the far end of a street could ignite even though the original fire lay far behind. Dry summers turned wood, straw, and cloth throughout the city brittle, making them more flammable than at any other time. Even stone and plastered walls retained heat-raising urban temperatures and allowing fire to spread more rapidly. During prolonged heat, wells gradually ran dry, further reducing the already limited water available for firefighting. When the wind suddenly shifted direction, all efforts to contain the blaze became meaningless as fire changed course faster than people could react. Rain was often seen as salvation, yet many great fires erupted during long droughts before rain ever arrived. Even when rain finally fell, rooftops already burning could smolder beneath layers of thatch flaring up again once the wind returned. Lightning was another cause of fire striking thatched roofs or tall wooden structures within crowded cities. High buildings such as watchtowers and churches were especially vulnerable, often becoming ignition points that spread flames downward into surrounding neighborhoods. Cold winter weather pushed people to burn fires more frequently indoors, increasing the risk of accidents in tightly sealed spaces. Strong winter winds could drive flames rapidly along city walls and rows of houses near the gates. In darkness, residents struggled to judge wind direction, and firefighting efforts made in the wrong direction often worsened the blaze. Many contemporary witnesses described fires as living creatures changing direction and devouring everything in rhythm with the wind. Nature made no distinction between rich and poor. Entire affluent districts could collapse in a single night. After each fire, people often blamed fierce winds or dry seasons, using nature itself to explain disasters beyond human control. Yet, regardless of blame, cities continue to exist under those same harsh conditions, and with each passing year, the risk of great fires returned, bound to the recurring cycle of wind and sun. Wind and weather demonstrated that even when humans acted carefully, nature could still shatter fragile efforts at control. It was the combination of human carelessness and natural forces that kept medieval cities in a constant state of anxiety. However, beyond wind and climate, another factor quietly magnified fire disasters: overcrowding and dense populations. From there, the story turns to cramped urban life, where people unknowingly push themselves ever closer to danger. Medieval cities often had extremely high population density, as city walls limited available space and forced people to live tightly packed together. Residents clustered inside the walls to trade, practice their crafts, and seek protection, but this very crowding multiplied the risk of fire many times over. Multiple families often shared a single house, dividing it into floors or cramped rooms, allowing fire to spread rapidly from one space to another. Poorer districts were even more congested, filled with makeshift houses built close together, made of inferior materials, with alleys barely wide enough for one person to pass. When fire broke out, the sheer number of people turned escape into chaos and danger. Children, the elderly, and the sick were easily trapped by thick smoke and narrow exits. Panicked crowds surged into the streets, clogging already tight passageways and preventing many from fleeing far enough from the flames. Carts, livestock, and abandoned goods left in the roads worsened the disorder. People rushing back to save belongings collided with those trying to escape, creating scenes of uncontrollable confusion. In the darkness, screams and smoke disoriented residents, causing many to run directly toward danger. Many homes also served as storage for flammable goods, such as cloth, straw, and oil, located right in the heart of densely populated neighborhoods. Commercial districts often stayed active late into the night, keeping fires lit and people moving about, increasing the likelihood of accidents. Inns were crowded with travelers, each bringing oil lamps and unfamiliar habits that made fire safety even harder to control. Once flames reached densely populated areas, the number of casualties rose rapidly within a short time. Rescue efforts were hampered by uncertainty. No one knew exactly how many people were trapped inside each house. Guards and officials were unable to control the crowds, turning evacuation into a spontaneous and dangerous process. Many injuries occurred not from fire itself, but from trampling or smoke inhalation during the panic. After the blaze, densely populated districts suffered the heaviest losses, with entire neighborhoods reduced to ashes. These losses left countless families homeless overnight, yet driven by necessity and trade, residents returned to rebuild in the very same dangerous locations. High population density turned every fire into not just material destruction, but a human catastrophe. Such crowding reflected the harsh survival choices people made in an era where safety was always a trade-off. From this packed urban life, attention must now turn to the role of dangerous professions within the city. It was often these fire-dependent workshops that became the starting points of the most devastating blazes. In medieval cities, many professions were forced to rely on large open fires every day, making the risk of fire a constant presence amid densely populated neighborhoods. Blacksmiths burned coal continuously to heat iron, sending showers of sparks flying each time a hammer struck glowing metal. Bread ovens burned day and night to feed the city's population, with intense heat and hot ash frequently spilling onto wooden floors. Dye workshops boiled large vats of dye over roaring fires, often placed close to wooden walls and low roofs that caught fire easily. Tanners used fire to dry animal hides, hanging sheets of leather near heat sources and keeping the air hot and dry at all times. These workshops were rarely isolated. Instead, they were wedged between homes and on inns and market stalls. A single small mistake could allow flames from a workshop to leap instantly into a neighboring house. Many great fires in history began in bakeries or forges where exhausted workers lost focus at the end of a long day. Hot ash was often dumped into the streets for cleaning, only to reignite at night when strong winds rose. Workshops stored coal firewood and oil close to their furnaces for convenience, unintentionally creating dangerous stockpiles of fuel. In cold weather, craftsmen stoked their fires higher to stay warm while working further, increasing the risk of fire during winter months. Many apprentices slept inside the workshops, causing fires to claim lives before anyone could escape. Cities did have regulations limiting fire use, but lax inspections meant that workshops rarely followed them strictly. Lords and city councils often tolerated these dangers because the trades generated taxes and essential goods. Even knowing the risks, residents accepted living beside workshops for the sake of trade and livelihood. Economic dependence made it impossible for cities to fully eliminate these dangerous sources of fire. When fires broke out, flames in workshops were often far more violent than in ordinary homes due to the intense heat and abundant fuel. From these ignition points, fire spread rapidly through the streets, quickly exceeding initial attempts at control. The very professions that sustained the city also planted the seeds of its greatest disasters. This was the paradox medieval cities were forced to accept in order to survive. The dense presence of workshops showed that cities were flammable not only because of their buildings, but because of their economic activity itself. Fire became a tool of survival, and at the same time, a destroyer lurking behind prosperity. From these occupational sources of flame, attention must turn to another, often overlooked factor: weak fire regulations and limited public awareness. It was this lack of enforcement and prevention that allowed obvious dangers to remain permanently unchecked. Despite many medieval cities having endured devastating fires, fire prevention laws developed slowly and lacked real deterrent power. Some places issued regulations banning the use of fire outside certain hours, yet supervision was inconsistent and easily ignored. People were accustomed to old habits and treated such rules as mere formalities, rarely observing them seriously in daily life. Many homeowners continued to build thatched roofs, store firewood indoors, and place hearths against wooden walls, despite warnings about fire hazards. Punishments were usually mild, typically fines or forced labor, and insufficient to change dangerous behavior in the long term. City officials lacked the manpower to inspect every neighborhood, especially the crowded and poorly managed poorer districts. When no fire was actively burning, the danger was often dismissed as people prioritized immediate livelihoods over risks that seemed distant or abstract. Many believed fires were acts of divine will or sacred punishment, encouraging resignation rather than proactive prevention. Such beliefs weakened motivation to improve safety as people felt powerless against a fate already decided. Practices like dumping hot ashes into streets or backyards continued, even though everyone knew embers could reignite. In commercial districts, shop owners favored convenience and profit over arranging safer conditions for fire use. Discussions about fire prevention were frequently postponed in favor of more urgent matters such as taxation and military security. Even when laws were enacted after disasters, enforcement gradually weakened as memories of suffering faded. New arrivals to the city were unfamiliar with local regulations and brought hazardous habits from their former homes. The mixing of populations made it difficult to form and sustain a shared sense of fire safety. In many cases, action was taken only after losses occurred, rather than to prevent them in advance. Communities lacked individuals willing to assume collective responsibility, turning warnings into words carried away by the wind. When fires finally erupted, the regulations once written offered no practical protection. Still warm ashes stood as proof of the failure of weak laws and fragile awareness. The city continued to exist amid the same old dangers, waiting for the next great fire. Loose regulations and limited public awareness left medieval cities unable to defend themselves against their most familiar threat. This lack of preparation revealed a deep gap between understanding and action in urban life of the period. From these human factors, attention must turn to a special type of urban space churches and monumental buildings. These structures, often assumed to be safe, repeatedly became unexpected sources of fire themselves. Churches and major public buildings in medieval cities were often regarded as sacred and safe, yet in reality, they posed a very high fire risk. These structures featured large wooden roofs, high ceilings, and dense timber frameworks that accumulated smoke dust and soot over many years. Hundreds of candles were lit daily for rituals, prayers, and funerals, creating a constant source of fire that was never fully extinguished. A single fallen candle or a sudden draft of wind could be enough to ignite fabric hangings, tapestries, or wooden decorations. Tall bell towers were frequently struck by lightning, especially during storms, causing fires to erupt from heights that were difficult to reach. When a church roof caught fire, flames spread rapidly along the long wooden beams, like dry kindling, leading to collapse in a short time. Fires that began in churches were extremely difficult to extinguish due to their scale and elevated structure far beyond the reach of ordinary buckets of water. Storerooms containing manuscripts and ritual objects made of paper, leather, and cloth intensified the blaze once ignited. At first, citizens often hesitated to dismantle sacred buildings, delaying fire containment at a critical moment. Fire alarms rang from high bell towers, yet at the same time they drew strong winds through large openings feeding the flames. Monasteries attached to churches usually contained kitchens, hearths, and food stores, adding further ignition sources near the city center. Other public buildings such as guild halls and tax warehouses also relied heavily on fire for lighting and heating. These structures were located at the heart of the city, so when they burned, flames spread rapidly in all directions. Their massive construction made demolition to create fire breaks nearly impossible within the limited time available. Many cities witnessed churches collapse in flames, dragging entire surrounding districts into ashes. Only after such disasters did people realize that large buildings were not merely symbols, but latent dangers. Reconstruction often reused the same materials due to the lack of viable alternatives within the constraints of the era. As a result, the fire risk posed by churches and major structures repeated itself across generations. Towers that once served as spiritual anchors became columns of smoke, signaling urban catastrophe. Cities were forced to live with this paradox throughout the long medieval period. These great buildings demonstrated that scale and sanctity did not equate to safety from fire. When they burned, the consequences far exceeded those of ordinary residential fires. From this sacred center, the narrative must turn to another often overlooked factor: the street system and urban spatial layout. It was precisely the design of roads and public spaces that repeatedly turned escape and firefighting into near impossible tasks. The street systems of medieval cities were typically narrow, winding, and shaped by long periods of unplanned organic growth rather than unified design. Many streets were only wide enough for two people to pass each other, making it difficult for light and air to circulate between closely packed tall buildings. When fires broke out, thick smoke quickly filled these confined spaces, causing residents to suffocate and lose their sense of direction within moments. Curved streets and dead ends turned movement into chaos, especially as panicked crowds searched desperately for escape routes. Water carts could not enter the narrow streets, forcing firefighting efforts to rely on long chains of hand-carried buckets. Steps opened drainage channels, and shop stalls spilling into the streets made movement even more hazardous. After nightfall, weak torchlight made smoke and flames difficult to distinguish within the maze-like alleys. Many houses opened directly onto narrow streets, so when fires erupted indoors, flames burst straight out into the public thoroughfare. Wind was funneled through these confined corridors, accelerating the spread of fire as if it were racing through a long pipe. Fleeing residents were often driven toward dead ends where no escape remained as smoke and fire closed in behind them. The few public squares became temporary refuges, but access routes were frequently blocked by crowds and abandoned belongings. Guards and officials struggled to direct evacuations because they could not see or control the overall situation within the tangled street network. Demolishing houses to create fire breaks proved difficult, as buildings were tightly interconnected and lacked any buffer spaces. Many cities had no wide central arteries, allowing fires to circulate around districts instead of being contained. Markets held directly on the streets further reduced space, with fabric tents and wooden stalls highly susceptible to ignition. During major fires, the streets meant to connect the city became its most dangerous obstacles. People found themselves trapped between smoke flames and crushing crowds, unable to move forward or retreat. After such disasters, it became clear that the streets had helped feed the fire rather than stop it. Yet widening streets was nearly impossible once cities had been densely built for generations. As a result, these dangerous street layouts persisted across centuries. Narrow streets revealed that medieval cities were not only vulnerable because of fire, but because their very spatial design trapped and sustained it. This structure turned every major fire into a life or death escape through a labyrinth of stone and wood. From the street layout, the narrative must turn to the final systemic cause: recovery and reconstruction after fires. It was the way medieval societies rebuilt their cities that allowed urban fires to recur endlessly. After every major fire, medieval cities were forced to rebuild quickly in order to sustain daily life. Yet the very manner of reconstruction sowed the seeds of the next disaster. Homeless residents often rebuilt their dwellings on the same foundations because land within the city walls was extremely limited and no alternatives existed. Scarcity of building materials pushed people to continue using wood thatch and straw mixed earth, even though the danger of fire remained unchanged. New houses were erected hastily to provide shelter from rain and cold, with little attention paid to safe spacing or fire-resistant construction. Cities needed commerce to recover quickly, so markets and workshops resumed operation almost immediately within the same cramped spaces. Lords and urban councils prioritized tax collection to stabilize power, rather than investing in costly changes to urban structure. Some new regulations were issued after fires, but they were gradually relaxed as population pressure and living needs increased. The poor were forced to build tightly packed houses to conserve land, making the recurrence of fires almost inevitable. Charred walls were crudely replastered, concealing structural weaknesses that would easily ignite in the future. Memories of disaster faded as new generations grew up without having witnessed the earlier devastation firsthand. The urgency of everyday survival led people to accept familiar risks rather than embrace difficult change. Even churches and major public buildings were reconstructed in the same manner, with wide wooden roofs and candle-based lighting. Rebuilt districts lacked fire breaks because every patch of land was vital for livelihoods. Craftsmen returned to their old workshops, continuing to stoke furnaces and forge iron amid dense residential areas. Any improvements that did occur were usually local and insufficient to alter the city as a whole. Thus, after each fire, the city merely changed its outward appearance while its internal dangers remained intact. People grew accustomed to believing that fire was unavoidable in urban life. This fatalistic mindset prevented disasters from being broken, instead allowing them to recur like a cycle of destiny. Over centuries, medieval cities accumulated histories layered with repeated fires. Each layer of old ash became the foundation for new houses and the fuel for the next blaze. The patterns of post-fire reconstruction reveal that cities did not learn quickly enough from the disasters they endured. Immediate survival consistently outweighed long-term safety in an age defined by instability. From this cycle of rebuilding, the narrative must close with a comprehensive view of why great fires became an urban fate in the medieval world. It was the combination of human behavior, materials, spatial design, and mindset that made such catastrophes difficult to avoid for centuries. When looking back at the full picture, it becomes clear that great fires in medieval cities were not random accidents, but the inevitable result of the way people lived. Fire was everywhere, from household hearths and craft workshops to churches, becoming an inseparable element of urban life. Densely packed houses, highly flammable materials, and narrow streets turned cities into massive blocks of fuel waiting to ignite. The lack of organized firefighting left people nearly powerless once a blaze grew beyond its initial limited scale. Nature, especially wine and prolonged dry seasons, often acted as a catalyst, pushing fires far beyond human control. High population density transformed each fire into a human catastrophe, not merely a loss of property. Workshops and large public buildings located at the city's core continued to nurture danger from within. Weak fire regulations and limited communal awareness meant early warnings were rarely taken seriously. Even after disaster struck, rushed reconstruction without fundamental change planted the seeds for the next fire. All these factors combined into an unbroken chain of causes that persisted for centuries. Medieval people were not entirely blind to the danger, but they were constrained by circumstance and the technological limits of their age. Livelihood security and tradition often outweighed costly and difficult reforms. As a result, great fires became part of the collective memory of cities, recorded in chronicles and passed down through oral accounts. Each generation grew up hearing stories of nights when the city glowed red and church bells rang in despair. These memories served both as warnings and as quiet acceptance of an urban fate defined by fragility. Only when building materials and architectural thinking changed in later centuries did this cycle of fire gradually break. But throughout the Middle Ages, fire remained the city's constant companion, sustaining it and destroying it at the same time. Great fires were therefore not merely disasters, but mirrors reflecting the true nature of medieval urban life. Through fire, one can clearly see humanity's limits in the face of its environment and the consequences of its own survival choices. That is why the history of medieval cities is inseparable from ash and painful rebirth. In retrospect, Great fires were not anomalies, but an essential part of an urban model unable to escape its inherent fragility. That fragility shaped the true character of medieval cities across many long centuries. And when the ashes finally cooled, cities rose again from the ruins, continuing to live alongside fire as an inescapable destiny. Thus, medieval urban history was written not only in stone and timber, but also in flame and enduring memory.